It's nice to see so many people coming in for this important teach-in that we're going to have this evening. At this critical time in the Ukraine and Gaza wars, we are really fortunate to have these wonderful speakers tonight. But the real focus of this teach-in is to empower ourselves to get active, or for many of us to remain active in raising the demand for ceasefire and negotiation, not more killing in both Gaza and Ukraine. I've put a few links in the chat. The first takes you to a form to get involved in our Mass Peace Action Ukraine campaign, to give more visibility and to pressure for ceasefire and negotiation as the only sensible way to end the Ukraine war. If the Ukraine war is something that you have strong feelings about, whatever your perspective on the war, on why it's happening, we're hoping that more and more people will come together around the idea that ceasefire and negotiations must be our policy. The second link takes you to an announcement of our rally a week from Saturday, February 24th, in downtown Boston, in downtown Crossing. February 24th is exactly the second anniversary of the devastating war in Ukraine and the 140th day of the Israeli attack on Gaza. If you live in Massachusetts, we hope you can come. The message is that these wars must end, and they must end now. To find out why they must end, to find out how they could end, and to get a deeper knowledge of U.S. policy in these wars, we turn to our speakers. Jean, back to you. Jean, you're muted.
We're ready to go. I welcome you to the teach-in sponsored by Mass Peace Action, CodePink, and Watertown Citizens for Peace, Justice, and the Environment. We are very pleased to have such wonderful speakers this evening. First, we'll hear from Stephen Kinzer, an award-winning author and foreign correspondent who's covered more than 50 countries on 5 continents. He's currently a columnist for the Boston Globe. He provides deep insight into U.S. foreign policy, and he teaches at Brown University. His book, Overthrow: America's Century of Regime Change, can provide you with deep understanding of what's going on in the world. So, Stephen, welcome. And the screen is yours.
I guess that's an expression we've had to get used to over these last couple of years. It's great to be with you, even on such a somber occasion. It's nice to know that there's a lot of effervescence out there, and that although I think the inside the Beltway mentality hasn't really changed much, we'll be hearing a little bit more about that in a few minutes. The mentality outside the Beltway in the rest of America, I think, is beginning to change, and much more quickly than that in Washington. So I want to talk a little about the background, particularly talking about Ukraine. So both of these wars, actually, the war in Gaza and the war in Ukraine, can only proceed because of the United States. Without the weaponry that the United States is sending, those wars would both end very quickly. So in that sense, they're similar. But in one other sense, they're different. And that is the role of the United States leading up to the war. The United States did not fuel the lead up to the war in Gaza. We've only fueled the war itself. that war probably would have broken out even without the United States. But the war in Ukraine is different. The war in Ukraine would never have happened without the United States. And we are now, both for Israel and for Ukraine, something quite different from the arsenal of democracy that Franklin Roosevelt said the United States should be. We've become something like the arsenal of genocide. We are the suppliers of others who do the dirty work and the killing and the dying for us. And I see Biden as very much a product of history. I don't really mind that he's so old in years, but I mind that his ideas are so old. He's a real product of the Cold War. He's a product of this idea that America is surrounded by enemies and you've got to go out searching for them and you've got to go fighting for them. Cooperation, advances toward peace, these are just not priorities for Biden and the people around him. And that has exactly produced the terrible tragedy that's unfolding in Ukraine today. The fact is, the war in Gaza has become even so horrific that in a way it's shocked people even more than what was happening in Ukraine. But I hope that the outrage at what's happening in Gaza will also play out when Americans look at what's happening in Ukraine. So I'd like to take you back a little bit and just refresh your memories about how we got into this war in Ukraine. I teach about history, and when I was working at the New York Times as a foreign correspondent, I always tried to write stories that explained a little bit about the background of conflicts that I was covering. This became almost an object of ridicule at the New York Times, and I later heard from a copy boy that a couple of editors were looking over one of my stories once, and one of them said to the other, "Do you think Kinzer will ever write a story about something that happened less than 100 years ago?" So I'm going to ignore that ignorant comment and try to take you through a little bit of how we got here so you can see the responsibility that the outside world, and particularly the United States, has. This story goes all the way back to the period right after World War II. In the early days of the CIA, in the late 40s and early 50s, the United States focused intently on Ukraine already. We considered Ukraine to be the most fertile place to sow opposition to the Soviets. If you hate the regime in Moscow, what you want to do is pour your resources into Ukraine and encourage Ukrainians to make trouble for Moscow. So the CIA did everything from establishing its own publishing company called Prolaw, based in New York, which was devoted entirely to producing Ukrainian language propaganda and dropping it in there, and plus having radio stations broadcasting in Ukrainian, all the way to dropping commandos. The CIA dropped dozens and dozens of commandos into Ukraine, all armed and trained for sabotage. This happened all during the 1950s. Just about every single one was immediately captured and killed. But we didn't care. As actually Alan Dulles, the head of the CIA, was asked about this. We're losing everybody. Do you think it's really such a good idea? And he said, with what I imagine might have been a smile, at least we're getting training for the next war. So we focused on Ukraine from the very beginning of the post-war period. And all during the 50s and 60s, it was a key target for subversion inside the Soviet Union. Finally, we moved to the period when the Cold War ended and the Berlin Wall fell. You're all familiar with the fact that James Baker mentioned that NATO would not expand 1 inch eastward if the Soviets would agree, if Gorbachev would agree to come in on an accord. But Gorbachev was actually the world's worst negotiator. He just said something like, "Oh, you're not going to expand NATO? Great, thanks. Let's have a pinky promise like we did in kindergarten." He should have said, "Great idea. Let's put it in writing and make it a treaty." But he didn't do that. That made it possible for George W. Bush to abandon the commitment that his father had made, not to expand NATO eastward toward Russia. In 2007, Vladimir Putin attended the Munich Security Conference and finally essentially said, I've had it with you. You are completely violating all the commitments you made to us. And I've got a little piece of his speech right there. What happened to the assurance our Western partners made after the dissolution of the Warsaw Pact? Where are those declarations now? No one even remembers them. But I would like to quote the speech of the NATO General Secretary in May 1990. He said then, quote, the fact that we are not ready to place any NATO army outside of German territory gives the Soviet Union a firm guarantee, unquote. Where are those guarantees? Right around this time, the U.S. ambassador to Moscow, the U.S. ambassador to Russia, sent back a cable on this subject back to the State Department. And the headline on the cable was, Niet means Niet, Russia's NATO enlargement red lines. So this is a cable from the U.S. ambassador in Moscow. And he writes, Ukraine and Georgia's NATO aspirations not only touch a raw nerve in Russia, they engender serious consequences they engender serious concerns about the consequences for stability in the region. Russia perceives encirclement. It also fears unpredictable and uncontrolled consequences. In the end, Russia would have to decide whether to intervene, and Russia does not want to have to face that decision. That ambassador was William Burns, now head of the CIA. And I got a shout out to Julian Assange, because without him, we wouldn't have all these wonderful memos to find out what people really think. Right after that speech, it was in the spring of 2008 that the United States announced at the Bucharest summit of NATO that Georgia and Ukraine will become members of NATO. That's a quote. The reaction in Moscow was, ain't gonna happen. We're never going to allow that. But the Americans never took that seriously. Unfortunately, the president of Georgia did. And he immediately invaded Russian-held territory, which brought the Russian army in to crush him in a matter of about 5 days. That was the first result of that Bucharest summit. In 2014, the government that had been legally elected in Ukraine was overthrown in a coup. It's the so-called Maidan coup. The United States was involved in that coup. The Assistant Secretary of State, Victoria Nuland, was in the Maidan handing out cookies to people and urging them to go ahead and overthrow their government. And she has that famous telephone conversation trying to place the next president of Ukraine in office. And I can't repeat it because her language is not suitable for us peace lovers. So that resulted in a great breakthrough for the United States. We imposed a government that was pro-Western and pro-American and anti-Russian. That's what we wanted. But in 2015, a wonderful breakthrough was made. That was the Minsk II agreement. And that provided for a ceasefire, withdrawal of weapons from the combat lines, self-government for regions near Russia, but Ukraine would remain united. Prisoners of war would be exchanged. And I thought this was great. It seemed to me that the project was ending now. The danger of war was over. And the president of France and the chancellor of Germany were the co-signers. They were the mediators. So just a few months ago, just last year, Angela Merkel gave an interview and she was asked, what happened? Why did the Minsk agreement collapse? She said, oh, we never intended to comply with it. We just signed it to gain more time to send more weapons into Ukraine. And then some smarty pants reporter in France went to find the guy who was president of France and signed that agreement, Hollande. And he said the same thing. He said, yeah, Merkel and I agreed, let's sign this, but we'll never do it. I'm not shocked by much in world affairs, but that one really shocked me. So that agreement collapsed. Then you had this period of John McCain and Lindsey Graham and all those senators going over to Ukraine and telling them, go fight the Russians. And they were angry at Obama because he would not supply heavy weaponry to Ukraine. I remember McCain saying, Ukraine wants to fight Russia and all Obama wants to do is send them blankets. Well, that would have kept a lot more Ukrainians alive. So we now have a situation of a hugely devastating war that has already resulted in casualties in the hundreds of thousands and is turning Ukraine into an environmental disaster. And this entire war could have been prevented by one sentence from Joe Biden. All Biden had to do when he took office was to say, NATO will not expand into Ukraine. If he had said that, Donbass and Lugansk would still be in Ukraine, Crimea would still be part of Ukraine, and there would be no war in Ukraine. Now, saying that the US is principally responsible for this crisis doesn't imply that Putin has no responsibilities, but it's important to understand that the United States pushed policies toward Ukraine that Russia and that Putin and other Russian leaders see as existentially threatening, a point they have made repeatedly over these years. So the political hypocrisy that I see among even opponents of the Gaza war who still want to support the war in Ukraine really shows how intense the United States is in its focus on this Ukraine war. The whole purpose of the war is to bleed Russia. Nobody in the United States has the slightest interest in Ukraine as an object in itself. In fact, I'm going to guess that the majority of members of Congress who vote for those tens of billions in aid for Ukraine could not pick out Ukraine on an outline map of the world. And so what lesson do we draw from this, just to bring it to a quick conclusion? It's time for the United States, and I think this applies in both situations, to mind our own business. We should allow local actors to play out their own disputes, not put a thumb on the scale and take sides. It's time, just like stopping patrols near China would be a good idea. Stopping sending bombs to Ukraine will end that war very quickly. Stopping sending bombs to Gaza will end that war very quickly. So the United States is in a guilty position, but also in a potentially positive position, because we are not only the suppliers who create the war and keep it going, but we also have the power to end it. And with that note, I'm going to hand it off and let some of you think about how we can do that.
Thank you very much. That was, we learned a lot and we will take it seriously. Next, we're going to hear from Phyllis Bennis, who directs the new Internationalism Project at the Institute for Policy Studies, focusing on the Middle East, US militarism, and UN issues. She's written many books, including Understanding the Palestinian-Israeli Conflict. There will be a new edition of that as soon as we give her a chance to do it, instead of making her come to all these webinars. Thank you. We look forward to hearing from you.
Thanks, Margaret. And thanks to MAPA for organizing tonight. Thanks to all of you for coming for this discussion. And I want to especially thank MAPA for holding tonight's event on the 21st anniversary of the day the world said no to war, February 15th, 2003, in the run-up to the Gulf War. I'm assuming that a lot of people listening were part of those protests that day. And we're seeing in a moment, we're seeing a very parallel moment in the mobilization, particularly against the Gaza war. The divisions around Ukraine globally were far more than around Gaza, but on Gaza, we have the world saying no to war and to genocide. You know, one of the things that we're looking at in Gaza in particular, well, but in both, there's two versions of a parallel reality in some ways between the wars in Gaza and in Ukraine. And that is how you come to understand those wars. And this is what Stephen was referring to, I think, too. How you come to understand those wars has everything to do with when you start the clock. If you start the clock on February 24th, 2022, the day that Russia invaded Ukraine, you have one understanding of what that war was about. Similarly, if you start the clock on October 7th, 2023, on the day that a number of Hamas and other militants broke down the wall that had been walling off the Gaza Strip for more than 17 years and carried out an absolutely unexpected level of military carnage, some of it against military people and military targets, some of it quite illegally and horrifically against civilian targets. But in that moment, you see when you start the clock determines how you come to understand it. Ceasefires are needed in both those wars. That is certainly true. And the US is central to both of them. I think, disagree a little bit with Stephen just on the emphasis. I think the US is as equally culpable of making the Gaza war possible as it was responsible for making the war in Ukraine possible. Before October 7th, the US was already paying for many, many years 20% of Israel's military budget. It was providing consistent protection so that Israeli officials, whether political or military officials, knew they would never be held accountable in the International Criminal Court, in the UN, or anywhere else. That's what made this possible, was that understanding of complicity by the US leading to absolute impunity for Israel. So our job is to force our government to move towards support for a ceasefire. There are obviously huge differences between those wars. The biggest difference militarily, of course, is that the Ukraine war is a war between armies, between two armies, not necessarily equal in all ways, but these are both armies. The Gaza war is a one-sided war against a militarily occupied civilian population with a few thousand militants fighting back, which is not to say I support how they've fought back, but it is a recognition of the vast disparities in what these wars look like. So a ceasefire is and remains our main goal. It's desperately needed in order not only to stop the killing right now in Gaza, but to achieve all of the other goals that people talk about, the provision of humanitarian aid in this absolutely devastated post-apocalyptic landscape in which 2.5 million Gazans are now living, to bring the hostages home, which they should be brought home. It's a complete violation of international law to take civilian hostages. They should be brought home. That can't happen without a ceasefire. So for all these reasons, we desperately need a ceasefire. I want to speak just generally to three different components of what we're looking at in Gaza. I'm assuming that most folks are watching the news. It's impossible to look away. It's impossible to look at the realities of what's going on in Gaza. So I'm not going to go through all of the numbers, how many people have been killed, how many have been injured, the percentage that are children. You know all that. I want to talk about three things. One is the current escalation that's being threatened against the town of Rafah. Another is the attacks on UNRWA, the UN agency that supports Palestinian refugees. And third, what's happening in terms of what we've accomplished as a movement, both the people's movement, some governments that are in line with us, again, parallel to February 15th of 2003, when we had an extraordinary second superpower, as the New York Times called it, on the front page the next day, made up first of people's movements all around the world, but secondarily matched by a number of governments who, for their own opportunist reasons, had come out against this war and said no to the US effort to go to war. And third, the United Nations became part of that as well. And we have a similar situation like that today. So the Rafah escalation first. Israel's goal for decades, quite publicly, although not always talked about in the mainstream press, et cetera, but it was never really a secret, for a large part of the Israeli population and a significant part of its governments, including periods when the Labor Party and its people were in power, the goal has been ethnic cleansing. The goal has been to turn Palestine into what Golda Meir said it was when it wasn't, which was a land without a people. It was not a land without a people. It was a populated land with an indigenous population that had lived there for millennia. Some of those people were Jewish, very small percentage, but there had been Jews there for millennia as well. And they were part of that society. They spoke Arabic, earlier they spoke Aramaic. They were Arabs and they were Jews. What changed was with the influx of European Jews and the colonial component of the settlement of creating a Jewish state in Palestine. I'm not going to go through that history. But what I am going to say is that this goal of ethnic cleansing, claiming as much land as possible with as few non-Jews in it as possible, has been and remains a major goal of the Israeli state. So right now, what we're seeing is a threatened escalation in a tiny sliver of the Gaza Strip, which is already a tiny sliver of land, one of the most crowded, densely populated pieces of land on the planet Earth, and one in which the overwhelming majority of the population, almost 90% of the people of Gaza, of the 2.3 million Gazans, have been kicked out of their homes by bombing, by the destruction of their homes, forced out at gunpoint, and forced to move south. Almost all of northern Gaza is now completely destroyed, and the population has overwhelmingly been forced to move to the south. That meant moving to the city of Khan Yunis, the biggest city in southern Gaza. Khan Yunis is now a ghost town, literally, because there are thousands, just like in the north, in Gaza City and elsewhere in the north. In Khan Yunis, there are thousands, nobody knows how many, people who were crushed when their apartments were bombed while they were sleeping. And some of them may have taken days to die, died ultimately of lack of water because they couldn't get out. They are now all dead. All those people are dead. We don't know how many thousands are there. So it is a ghost town in so many different ways. But in this context, we're seeing an effort to ethnically cleanse almost all of the southern part of Gaza as well, the part that the Israeli government claimed was going to be the safe haven. There's nothing safe in Gaza. No one and nowhere in Gaza is safe. Right now, the Israelis are looking at three possibilities of where to force the last remnants of people. 1.5 million people are now crowded into the town of Rafah, a small town that once had a population of about 150,000. Now there's almost 10 times that, 100 times that, 100 times that. We have 1.5 million people crowded into this town with nothing, no sufficient food, almost no water, no electricity, no fully functioning hospitals, no medicine, no nothing. And now they're being told that Rafah is the next target and they must leave. To go where? They are as far south as they can go. So the three choices that apparently Israel is vacillating about, one is the tiny, even much tinier sliver of land to the west of Rafah called Massawa. Massawa it's not even a town. There's nothing there. There's no shelter, no water, no food, no nothing. And this is a territory exactly the size of the Tel Aviv airport. It's 6 square miles, 2 miles by 3 miles. Imagine 1.5 million people suddenly appearing in a strip of land like that. I think they'd all have to be standing up the whole time. There's not even room for people to lie down. And there is no shelter. There is no shelter. That's one option. Another option is the Egyptian option. The Israeli preference is for the Palestinians to just be pushed out into the Sinai desert, never to be allowed to return home to Gaza. These are mostly refugees. 70% of the Gaza population were already refugees from 1947-48, at the time that the State of Israel was created, what Palestinians call the Nakba, the catastrophe, where they were dispossessed of their homes and never allowed to go back. They are now facing that for a second, third, fourth, or fifth time. And so far, the Egyptian government is saying, we don't want them. We don't want a bunch of Palestinians coming in here who will never be allowed home. We don't want to have to take care of them. We don't want to have people who may well be supporters of Hamas or maybe militants within Hamas. We don't want anything to do with this. If you throw them out into our country, we are going to tear up the 1979 Camp David Agreement, the first recognition by any Arab country of Israel. We're going to end that. And the US is saying, we don't want that. We will not support it. But at the end of the day, they may well support it. And if they gave Egypt enough money and enough debt relief and enough military support, the Egyptian dictator would probably support it as well. The last possibility, which is the most likely and yet the one that the Israelis like the least, is the idea of pushing all these Palestinians that have been forced into the southern tip of Gaza back to the north, back where there is now nothing, where 50% of the buildings have been completely demolished and the other 50% are almost entirely unable to provide any shelter for anyone. But they would push people back to the north with no food, no water, no nothing. So that's the first thing, just to tab that as something that is urgently becoming our focus, not because it's not about a ceasefire, it's precisely why we need a ceasefire. The demand for a ceasefire must remain our immediate and medium-term and long-term demand until we have one. The second part of this, and it's absolutely linked to the escalation in Rafah, is the attack on UNRWA that's going on. You all remember that on just hours after the International Court of Justice issued its incredible ruling against Israel, finding Israel potentially guilty of genocide and assigning 6 provisional measures to be carried out by Israel in response to make sure that if there is a genocide, that it's stopped, and if there's a looming genocide, to make sure it doesn't go forward. So in that context, it was a clear answer. That was how the US and ultimately the United States, who immediately responded with a cutoff of all of its support to UNRWA, a claim based on 0 evidence having been presented, a claim that 12 individuals in Gaza who worked for UNRWA were somehow connected to what the events of October 7th and may have participated in those events. This was one of those classic even if situations. There was no evidence presented. It was simply an allegation. There are 13,000 UNRWA employees in Gaza. 12 of them allegedly played some role in what happened on October 7th. Nobody knows if that really happens or not. We haven't seen any evidence. But the US immediately said, we're cutting off all aid. That's unacceptable. We have to have a full investigation, et cetera. But in the meantime, we are going to commit further war crimes. The US committed these war crimes, cutting off the aid that provides food, water, medicine, shelter to 2.3 million people. That's completely unacceptable, complete violation. They went on to they went much further than that and got 18 other countries to say they would also end their aid. This is, again, with no evidence, purely an allegation. A second allegation was made just a few days ago, this past weekend, when Israel made a sudden claim that, oh, what do you know? It turns out that one of the tunnels under the headquarters of UNRWA was being used by Hamas, and therefore we're cutting off all possibility of any work there, any carrying out our humanitarian aid work. The other point about UNRWA, and I want to make this really quick because I have only another minute, ending UNRWA, which an end to the US and European funding would lead to, is not only about ending humanitarian aid that is so desperately needed right now, it also means the end of any international recognition of the right of return, because UNRWA is the only international agency whose mandate includes recognition and protection of Palestinians' rights as refugees to return to their home. The last point I want to make is just about where our movement is. The movements have accomplished amazing things all around the world. Spain has announced that they will not any longer allow the shipment of any arms to Israel. One of the Belgian regions has said that they will not allow the shipment of gunpowder, which Israel is depending on. Japan has said that they will no longer keep up an alliance with an Israeli military contractor. The Netherlands had a court rule that they must end within 7 days sending parts for the F-35 bombers, the stealth bombers that Israel has gotten from the United States and is using to bomb Gaza. These are the accomplishments of our movement around the world. The biggest accomplishment, of course, is that of South Africa, having gone to the International Court of Justice, leading to a recognition of the likelihood of genocide, the possibility that Israeli actions are those of genocide. The Palestinian rights movement in this country and globally is stronger than it has ever been before. It's engaging with power, and we're seeing the effect of it. The reasons that the Biden administration and Biden himself right now are changing their language. They are not yet changing their policies, so we can't claim this as a victory yet. But the reason they are changing their language to talk about how the Israelis should not do X, Y, and Z is precisely because of the power of this movement. And what our movement needs right now is to broaden out. We need the breadth of everybody who's willing to say, I don't necessarily agree with how you talk about genocide or whatever. If they're willing to say, we have to stop supporting what Israel is doing, That's the basis for broadening our movement. I'm going to stop now. We can come back to questions later. Thank you.
Thank you. Inspiring as always. And now welcome Medea Benjamin, co-founder of CodePink, co-author of The War in Ukraine, Making Sense of a Senseless Conflict, and one of the most prominent and daring anti-war organizers in the country. And we are all eager to hear what you've been up to.
Well, thank you so much. And thank you to Stephen and to Phyllis for those great overviews. When it comes to Ukraine, I think it's important to recognize that for a long time now, there has been a stalemate in that war. And rather than recognizing the stalemate, the U.S. is determined to keep the war going. We see that Zelensky has fired his Minister of Defense, brought in a new one. He's now saying there need to have about 500,000 new conscripts, trying to pass through a very draconian conscription law that would say that all males 25 and over have to register, and that if they don't appear, their assets could be seized. There are so many Ukrainians who have been dying in this war, and they're absolutely exhausted. I was there during the summer, and there was already this exhaustion. Imagine now. The issue of how do we move to the dialogue that Stephen talked about is something that we really have to fault our government about. Some of us might know that there were discussions taking place between the U.S. and between Ukraine and Russia a month after the war started that was nixed by the US and the UK. But even more recently, there was a Reuters piece that just came out that talked about at the end of 2023 and the beginning of this year, Russia was reaching out to the US for talks through intermediaries, and the US nixed those as well. You might have heard part of Tucker Carlson's interview with Vladimir Putin when he also said, we are ready for dialogue, and the U.S. just dismissed that. We don't believe him. So the U.S. is keeping this war going, and that's why Biden is so desperate to get this funding. The Europeans did pass a $40 billion Euro package, but that is going through until 2027, and it really just keeps things at the status quo. So Biden thought that with the opposition that there is among some people in the Republican Party, including Donald Trump, to continue to fuel the war in Ukraine, that he would be very clever by putting this in a package that included money to Israel, which the vast majority of Democrats and Republicans would support, as well as throwing in more money to antagonize China. And the Republicans were saying that there had to be a border component. That was the $118 billion package that the Biden administration called one and done, meaning you have this one big package, you pass the whole thing through, and then you're done until the elections happen. Well, it didn't quite turn out that way. When it came to the border issues, the Republicans and Democrats were both feuding about that, and Republicans said, no way. And so what did Chuck Schumer do? He took out the border issue, and then he rammed through in the early hours of Tuesday the package that is $95 billion that includes all of those other components. So really fueling a war in the Middle East that could become a regional war very easily, fueling the war in Ukraine that could become a regional war there as well, and fueling the war in the Indo-Pacific that could become a war with China. And this is what passed in the Senate this week. What's important to look at is who passed that. Well, it was every single Democrat except for Merkley from Oregon and Peter Welch from Vermont, and then the independent Bernie Sanders. Those were the only three that work with the Democratic caucus that voted against it. The rest voted in favor of this bill, as did many Republicans. In fact, 22 Republicans defied Donald Trump, voting in favor of the bill. Final passage was 70 in favor and 29 against. The head of the speaker in the House announced as soon as that was passed that would be dead on arrival in the House. And so what is happening on the House side, we really don't know. We were there all day today with an entourage of about almost 100 people and the actress Susan Sarandon going through the halls of Congress and having with a number of members, Rashida Tlaib, Cori Bush, of a ceasefire are trying. I forgot to say something very important in the $95 billion package. It prohibited any aid to UNRWA. And while it did have money there for humanitarian, it says none of that could go through UNRWA. And so on the Democratic side, on the House side, there are a number of Democrats that are very, very concerned about the UNRWA issue and trying to think of a way to put enough pressure on the White House to unfreeze, unsuspend that money. In the meantime, Speaker Johnson, what are his issues? Well, he personally would like to pass this entire thing. He would like money to go to Ukraine. He would like money to go to Israel. He would like the money to go to Taiwan. But he is being constrained by the Freedom Caucus. And so isn't it ironic that those of us who do not want to see any more money to go to either Ukraine or to Israel have to look towards these fights within Congress and look towards the extreme right of the Republican Party to try to keep it from even going to a vote. Now, I don't think we should take solace in that because I think Jeffries from New York, he takes a massive amount of money from AIPAC, as do so many of the other members of Congress. And he is saying by hook or by crook, he is going to get that bill to the floor. So he is looking to go around the Republican head, the Republican speaker, to find a way to get it to the floor. And if it does get to the floor, there will be enough votes for it to go through. And especially if they divide it up and make it just for Israel, that would pass with flying colors. And so it is important that we keep the pressure on. Congress is out of session next week, which means they'll be in their home districts, which means it's a great time to harass all the members of Congress. And I love all the grassroots organizing that Phyllis has referred to, and hope to see a lot of it in the next week, where people are going to the town halls and they're going to the homes of the Congress people. And here in Washington, D.C., if you haven't heard about it, right outside D.C. in Alexandria, there has been a 2-week encampment outside of the home of Anthony Blinken that has just been absolutely remarkable. And so these kind of things are putting pressure, are making these Congress people feel the heat. And that is the only thing we have going for us now, is to increase this pressure, to make them recognize that we understand that despite the media propaganda that is so pro-Israel, despite the views in Congress that are so tainted by the money they take from AIPAC, in some of the polls, including CNN polls, show 66% of the American people wanting a ceasefire and 80% of Democrats. And so when we go into these Democratic offices, we have to say to them, who are you representing? Is it the 80% of Democrats that want a ceasefire, or is it AIPAC? Is it the pro-Israel lobby that you are representing? And this really gets under their skin. And this is the kind of thing we have to do. And in the long term, as we are doing right now, pushing for, we want you to come out with a public statement calling for a ceasefire. We want you to come out with a public statement saying no more money to Israel. We want you to come out with a public statement saying that you will that you are in favor of money going to UNRWA. We want you to say that you will not take money from AIPAC. Now, that's a very big ask, but I think as we move forward with this movement, this will be something that we need to get AIPAC money to be seen as the dirty money that it is. And this could help change not only the narrative, but change the way our foreign policy is made. So thank you very much. And let's work as hard as we can to stop this money from going to Ukraine to fuel that war, and stop this money to go to Israel in the midst of a genocide. Thank you.
Thank you, Medea. That was very stimulating. And I'm going to turn this over to Paul, who's going to do the Q&A part of the webinar.
Okay, thank you, Jean. So we have a lot of things to think about here. I wonder if just before, let me just mention to people that we are expecting Dennis Kucinich. He's kind of ill, to tell you the truth, but he wants to be with you tonight. And so he will be joining us for a short time at some point here, and probably around 8 o'clock. So we'll switch to Dennis when it's appropriate, when he gets on. But first, I'm just wondering whether Phyllis, Stephen, or Medea have any questions to ask each other, or any comments to make to see whether, get a little dialogue going between the three of you.
Well, having been so focused on writing, I would point out that you can't have dialogue between three people. It has to be among. I would be correcting that on your paper.
Let me make that. I got that right here. Between, not among. I mean, among,
right.
Between. Yeah, I
do. I don't want to say that I'm a stickler or anything. I don't have a OCD or anything. I think one of the points that I find so amazing about this story is one that Medea brought up, that how can it be that the Democratic Party has fallen to such a place where, when we're looking for allies to stop sending bombs to kill people every single day, we have to go to people who hate abortion and hate gun control and think that Trump won the last election. I saw a story in the Washington Post a while ago, and it said that, yes, there is a small Republican caucus that's against war and against intervention, but you shouldn't be too worried because the majority of the party doesn't believe that. And I thought to myself, well, at least there's a minority caucus in the Republican Party. We don't have anything like that in the Democratic Party. And my one other observation, particularly for those of you that are involved in various social justice movements, like these great movements that have all come up since George Floyd in recent years that are demanding all kinds of changes in domestic policy. Every time you guys come up with an idea like Medicare for all or community college should be free, you always get scoffed by people who say, where are we going to get the money for that? You people have to realize that there is a huge pile of money, and link your cause to the cause of non-interventionism abroad. One of the biggest reasons why China is where it is today, and why we are where we are today, is that in the last, since 9/11, the United States has spent, according to my own cost of war project at Brown University, $6 trillion on foreign wars. And during this period, China has spent $0 on foreign wars. So it's important for those of you that are out there active on domestic social issues to realize that there's an intimate connection between providing the funds for the projects for which you're advocating and cutting the idea of spending billions to buy bombs to kill people.
If I could just respond to 2 points that you made, Stephen, I actually think that we should be going to the audience for questions, but I do feel compelled to answer 2 points. One is, I think people on this call do understand that. And I would just refer people who are looking for new resources. The National Priorities Project at IPS has their great city and state and county-based online tool for trade-offs, that with a couple of clicks, you can find out exactly how much money your town, your city, your state, the country as a whole, your congressional district are spending on a host of different military projects, from the entire military budget to the war in Afghanistan from 2001 on to, a number of others. And compare that, and then you hit one more button and you get a whole set of trade-offs of what that money could be used for in that town, how many kids could get into Head Start, how many jobs could be created, how many houses could be retrofitted with green technology, et cetera. I think that is really important. The question of resources to make that easier is important, and that's a really useful one. I'll stop there because I think we should get to the audience questions.
Okay, great. Cole, could you unmute Smith? Donald, you want to ask you as soon as you?
This is mostly for Stephen Kinzer. What surprises me is that academic leaders and there are journalists and academics who are very anti-war and agree with us about Gaza and Ukraine. I'm surprised they don't get together and become more visible, especially academics, and of course, they're religious leaders too. But since you're involved with Brown University and you're a senior journalist, can you please comment on organizing journalists and academics to amplify our voices? Thank you.
Organizing journalists is a big challenge on anything. We're just not good people to join organizations. I don't think the problem is so much that journalists who oppose war are not organized. I think the problem is that all media outlets are effectively closed to us. You cannot find in any major publication in the United States anybody, as far as I can know, I'm hoping to be corrected, who has a regular voice that will say the kinds of things that we're talking about tonight. Now, you can agree or disagree with what we've said, but it does represent a piece of American opinion, and it should be in the press. It is really amazing to me to see how relentlessly every single voice, particularly in Ukraine, that has been raised against American policy has been squashed. I mean, I don't want to go into details, but I write a column for the Boston Globe. You don't see me writing about Ukraine. You don't see me writing about Gaza. You don't see me writing about China and Taiwan. I try. I'm doing the best I can. But let me tell you, there is a strong wall around mainstream media that's trying to prevent these alternative views from penetrating, and it's been distressingly successful.
Thanks, Stephen. Let's go to thanks, Donald. Thanks. Let's go to Elizabeth Fatah.
Yes. It's very frustrating.
Oops, wait. Come on back on. Unmute yourself.
Sorry, I pushed the wrong buttons. I'm having with my computer.
Okay. All right, now?
Yep, go ahead.
Yeah, okay. It's frustrating for people like me who have been a peace activist for certainly over 50 years. And nothing changes. And I think part of it is our political system, the two-party system. And I see now more and more people are actually talking about that. Of course, I realize that's long term. But what I was wondering, is there anyone in the Democratic Party or someone who is influential that could speak out? I don't see that. I don't see someone who's coming out and saying the things that you have all been saying. Is there anyone out there?
Yeah, there are. There's a lot of people out there, and a lot of them get into the press. You do have to look for it. Stephen's right that it's not easy. It's not regular. It's not the mainstream position. But
Right.
There has been 25 years of work in this country to change the discourse on Palestine-Israel. And it's had an incredible impact. It's had an incredible impact. We see the word Nakba in the mainstream press daily. We see Palestinian voices in the pages of the New York Times, the Washington Post, leading the stories on NPR on a daily basis. That never happened 5 years ago. Certainly didn't happen 25 years ago. It started to happen about 3 or 4 years ago, and it's happening extraordinarily now. I think it's tricky because anybody coming into the movement today looks at the press and said, God, this really sucks. This is really awful. It's really biased. It's really unbalanced. Absolutely true. What is also true is that it is so much better than it was 2 years ago, 10 years ago, 20 years ago. And it's taken an incredible amount of work of these movements led by Palestinians. The organization IMEU, for instance, the Institute for Middle East Understanding, Palestinian-led media criticism and media influencing organization, When they started 10 years ago, they just celebrated their 10-year anniversary. It was one person with an idea. She couldn't raise money. She couldn't get any attention because it just seemed crazy that you could have any influence on the mainstream press. They now have a staff of, I don't know, 20 or so people, maybe more than that. They can't keep up with the requests because we have transformed this discourse. So I think it's really important to recognize how far we have come. It's not enough because there's a genocide underway and we're not yet able to stop it.
Right.
But we've got to recognize what we have accomplished and continue that.
Well, and let's recognize that this election might hinge on Biden's position towards Israel. And when did we ever think that could happen before, with all the young people that are disgusted, the Arab American community, the Muslim community, progressive Jews? I mean, this is a major historical sea change that might affect the election.
For the first time in history. Right.
I think Dennis Kucinich joined, by the way.
He did. I'm trying to put him on screen. I'm really
Oh,
screwing
sorry.
up my computer, but
Okay,
yeah.
we'll come back to questions after
Welcome,
we
Dennis.
get a chance to hear from Dennis.
Oh, what is wrong with this?
Hello. Hello?
Dennis, can you hear us?
I can, yeah, I lost
Oh, we
you.
got you. We have you now.
Okay.
Thanks for joining.
Yeah, with a lot of technical help here from Elizabeth.
Thank you, Elizabeth.
Oh, there we are. There you are, baby. You see? Okay.
Okay. Okay. My voice is a little hoarse. I've just gotten over a cold, so I didn't want to miss this opportunity to share some time with you, discuss these matters of urgent importance. Is there, Paul, is it okay for me to go forward?
Yes, go right ahead.
Yeah, I just wanted to thank you and all the people in Massachusetts. Mass Peace Action helped organize this. I know you have people who signed up from all over the country, and Paul, you and your team there, your work has been exemplary in keeping a direction focused and trying to bring about a ceasefire in both Gaza and in Ukraine. I think we can start this discussion with the understanding of the role of the United States in both of these, because we act as though these events, not we in this call, but some act as though there's a separation here in terms of policy. The United States has had a longstanding policy of encirclement of Russia, and it has been a disaster, and it has put us in a position of being at odds with someone who should have been an ally, and now we are using Gaza. We're using Ukraine as a proxy for a war with Russia. The whole thing is started badly and it's going to end badly. We're here talking about a ceasefire with a war that should have never happened. That the kernels of it were set back in the 2010s, and the United States basically, as everyone on this call knows, overthrew the legitimate government of Ukraine because it had a policy which was too friendly to Russia. When you consider the closeness geographically of the countries, when you consider that there was a lot in common between the people of the two countries, and you consider the history that Ukraine and Russia has had in previous wars. it's inexplicable how the United States could intervene to try to split, create not just a cleavage, but to create a war front in Ukraine, which is what we did, which is what we've done. Now, when you think about it, we're talking about having asking for a ceasefire. Our country right now is getting ready to put tens of billions of dollars more into propelling these wars. You wonder what in the world is it all about? Well, it's still that old Cold War psychology that is merged with desire for control of energy resources. And I mean, the very thought that we were going to overthrow the Russian government is insane. And the very thought that we couldn't have somehow worked out things with them is also equally wrong. Matt Taibbi and Michael Schellenberger and another one of their colleagues published a report today that I would urge every one of you to read, because it's about how the CIA cooked the intelligence and actually told the story, you know, when they told the story about Trump, Russia wanting Trump, the so-called Russiagate story that turned out to be a farce. Well, they also apparently had intelligence of, you know, whatever probity that that Russia would have preferred Hillary Clinton. I mean, it's almost a farce, but this story is chilling, and it's worth looking at because it shows you how intelligence is manipulated, how misinformation, disinformation is king, how we're never told a straight story about anything from the government, ever, about anything, especially about matters relating to foreign affairs, military necessity, national security. We're never told. It's all a lie. And Taibbi and Schellenberger's story point that out. It's really important to read, and I would urge you to check it out. But anyhow, so Ukraine ends up being a sacrificial lamb, and a ceasefire is possible at any time. We have to focus on our demands, which you're doing, on the U.S. government, on those congressional representatives who are responsible for supporting this sad state of affairs. So, should there be a ceasefire in Ukraine? Absolutely. In a war that should have never started. Back to Gaza. Gaza is one of the great human catastrophes of our time. I mean, genocide is happening right in front of everyone's eyes. And our country is complicit in it. Whether or not the International Court of Justice is ready to clearly call it that, we can't say, you know, if a friend of ours has committed a murder, we can't say, well, you're my friend, so it's not murder. No, this is murder, and it's genocide, and it's ethnic cleansing, and it's every manner of evil that is known to our species is being committed there. And a ceasefire is mandatory. There should have never been a war. And the war is being conducted against. It's really not a two-sided war. And of course, in both cases, you have to look at the history of, let's say, in the case of the Palestinians in Gaza, you have to look at the history of usurpation, of long suffering, of apartheid that has been the back.
Hi, Mom. How's it going? Okay.
Cole, can you find that?
Hello?
Trying to figure out who it is, yeah.
We can hear you okay, Dennis.
Should I continue?
Yes.
Yeah.
Yeah, so you have to consider that longstanding history of a rather one-sided conflict, that the U.S. has been condigned to permit to fester and fester and fester at the cost of the human dignity and the lives of Palestinians in Gaza and the West Bank, for that matter. I'm having served in Congress for 16 years, I'm fully familiar with the influence that Israel has on the Congress, and I saw it. It was very easy to see, actually. And we had one vote where a senior member of Congress rushed in breathless, just about to miss the vote, just made it under the wire just before he slipped his card in. Is this the vote for Israel? He exclaimed with a question mark. And this reflexive support without seriously questioning the conduct of the state of Israel can only be one thing, and that is that we're not questioning because we're complicit in it. So yes, a ceasefire is mandatory. And how do you get a ceasefire? Stop providing arms. It's pretty simple. Stop providing arms, and there'll be a ceasefire a lot quicker, because they have to use up all the guns they have, all the bombs they have. But if the U.S. continues to provide weapons to both Ukraine and to Israel, ongoing nightmare. And it sets the stage for wider conflict. What's happened in Israel has brought about, or what's happened in Gaza has brought about a response from the Houthis in Yemen, which is, in a sense, predictable, because not every nation is willing to sit by and watch this happen without objecting. And now you have the United States bombing Yemen, and our money is helping to bomb Gaza. Our money is helping to bomb Ukraine. It's a state of affairs which is so repugnant that it cries out for justice. And when that doesn't occur, it certainly cries out for political action. So this organization, the people on this call, all can have great influence in terms of raising the issue everywhere in public fora and to your member of Congress, and make demands, because this isn't something that can just be taken casually, like you're talking about passing the biscuits or something at a dinner table. That's a very serious life or death question. It's also the life or death of the planet itself, because the United States, with its consistent bellicosity here, has set itself against not only Russia and Arab nations, but also China. This idea that we should give aid to Taiwan, like Taiwan hasn't asked for any aid. We're looking at a situation where we're trying to anywhere there's a little bit of a flame, we want to throw gasoline on it. So I'm it's good to be with you. I've got time for a few questions. I congratulate you for your push for ceasefires in both Gaza and Ukraine. It's the right thing to do, and I support it wholeheartedly.
Well, Dennis, thank you so much, and we wish you rapid return to full health. Thank you so much for spending some time. Paul Anawalt, do you have a question for Dennis?
Hello?
Are you there, Paul? Okay, how about Leslie?
I'm here. No. Hi there.
Oh, you
I'm
are here.
sorry.
Okay.
I'm here. Can you hear me now?
Yeah.
Okay. Thank you so much, everybody, all the speakers, and Mr. Kucinich. Thank you so much. Who should we vote for President of the United States in 2024 in order to foster and protect the peace, the environment, and the economy? And why did Dennis Kucinich leave the RFK Jr. campaign? Thank you.
Yeah, I would say, first of all, with respect to the presidential race, it's a tough one. You know, I don't think that I don't have a recommendation. That's for sure. Period. You know, I just don't have a recommendation. I don't have one, and I will not have one. They're both for war. Of course, you know, Mr. Kennedy's still in the race, and he's for the war in Gaza. And you know, I would say that my reason for leaving was connected with some policy differences we had, and I'm going to leave it at that. But I do want to say this: that as a result of leaving the campaign, I decided to continue to make a difference. So 3 weeks ago in Ohio, I declared that I'm running once again to go back to Congress, representing a district that was newly formed a year ago. Half of my old congressional district is in it, and I'm running as an independent. I don't support what the Democratic Party is doing on war, and one way in which I state that is to run as an independent. Can I win? Yes, because I'm better known than either the incumbent, who famously said right after October 7th, so we're gonna turn Gaza into a parking lot, quote unquote. His name is Max Miller. He's a congressman. He's been in 1 year, and he said we're going to turn Gaza into a parking lot. It's very machismo, aggressive statement, and created a sensation with that. But also, it was it was a call for genocide. It was an incitement to genocide. And this guy's a member of Congress, and he's representing the district that I'm running in. So I'm the other person is a Democrat. I doubt it'll stay in a race, but I'm whether he does or not doesn't matter. I'm better known than either of them. I have a longstanding constituency in a major part of the district, and I expect to win. I know that's not the purpose of this call, but I'll tell you that Kucinich.com is where you can get more information. You'll see what I'm saying in the campaign, and I'm determined to, if I'm elected as an independent, I'd like you to think about this. In a closely divided Congress, an independent could be the swing vote. And let me tell you, I'll use it for peace. I'll use it for justice. I'll use it for a vision of a world as one, not a world divided. And so I'm working, sending that campaign up. My name will be on the ballot in November in Ohio. And in Ohio, they don't put a party under your name when you run as an independent. There's just my name, and that's good enough for me. But I've got a pretty good chance in this.
Great. Well,
from what I've heard, I would vote for you for president and Congress. Thank you so much.
Okay, I think we should go to our urgent action with Cole Harrison. Dennis, we're going to have ask everyone on the call to send a message to our Congress about the votes on military aid to Israel. And
yeah.
so
and Ukraine.
They're both together. That's right.
Well, they put them all together. You know, I mean, there's different bills. They get it. I think you need to make a statement. No military aid to Israel. No military aid to Ukraine. No assistance of any kind to Taiwan. Let's just, and that has to be part of a work for a ceasefire. Remember, keep that in mind, because there's a direct connection between blocking the ability of people to get the money and getting a ceasefire, because then people think about it more. Why should you think about a ceasefire if they're getting all this money and all these it's not just the material, the arms that come in, but it's also the extra benefits that come in, which are, result in theft of assets that the U.S. Sends over. Our country's always being taken. Well, I can't say we've been taken for a second, because we're happy to do it, but the taxpayers of America are a sucker. And that's the other thing I want to share with you. I believe that all of us who care about peace also have to make the budget of the United States and the deficit of the United States an issue. Brown University has a website. I think it's called the Watson Institute, where they've determined that of a $34 trillion national debt, $8 trillion of it is due to wars since 9/11. I mean, think about that, how extraordinary it is that the average American family is paying has paid close to $100,000 for this war. So every family. So, this is horrendous. And if people start to understand that it's not in their financial interest to have a war, that it's against the interests of the country to keep going into debt for these wars, that's something that gets people's interest. I know this because I'm out talking to people. So I'm just sharing that idea with you, that it might be something that you want to think about in terms of communication, that it's about the money that we're spending as well. We are all concerned about the moral imperative here, but I'll tell you, for some people, the financial imperative is more important. And if you put them both in the same package, I think we have a better chance.
Dennis, thank you so much for those comments. Cole, do you want to walk us through this?
Thank you, Congressman Kucinich. I'm getting some kind of feedback. I'm just having computer problems tonight, but it's the issue that Medea talked about a few minutes ago. There's a package in Congress to provide $91 billion in foreign military aid to, above all, to Ukraine, and get $61 million to Ukraine, $14 million to Israel. Billion, thank you, and some to Taiwan and some other military stuff. And so the Senate passed it on Tuesday morning at 5 in the morning. The House is debating whether to bring it up. But if you send that message, we will try to stop it.
Yeah, I think that's important to do that. Medea is always on point on these things. And thank you, Medea. I mean, really, thank you. Really, I think we all should stop for a second and understand the tremendous commitment that Medea Benjamin has had for peace, putting herself on the front line.
Yeah.
Day after day.
Sure. Cole, is there something that people should respond to here, or is this something they should just do tomorrow?
No, I put it in the chat a couple of times, and they should just click where it says masspeace.us/no-dirty-deal.
And I'm glad you're having these. This is really important, and it's, there is such an effort to try to squelch any kind of opposition to what's happening in Gaza. It's really horrific, and to speak out is imperative right now.
Yeah. Well, that is going to be the focus of everyone's actions, that's for sure.
Thank you.
We'll just give people 30 seconds more to finish clicking on that link, filling in your name in support of cutting off the aid. And then we'll come back for questions. Dennis, you're certainly welcome to join our other speakers in answering questions, but I know you're probably gonna have to cut off. So we just want to thank you so very,
Yeah.
very much for
Well,
joining.
yeah, Paul, thanks so much. And I want to thank everyone for participating in this very important teach-in. And when the weather breaks, we ought to, especially in the East, we ought to be holding teach-ins at colleges, like we did years ago about Vietnam.
Let's do that.
I really appreciate all of you. And again, the website is Kucinich.com, and you can always communicate with me through there. Thanks, everyone.
Okay, thank you, Dennis.
Love all of you.
We'll be in touch.
Okay, bye now.
Okay, I think thanks. Goodbye. Feel better.
Thank you.
So let's go back to questions, if that's okay. We have Medea had to run off to create more trouble, nonviolent trouble at the U.S. Congress, which is nonstop for her right now. So we're very fortunate to have Phyllis and Stephen still with us. We got a bunch of questions up here. Let's go to, is this Peter Barris?
Yeah, go ahead,
That's
Peter.
me. Thank you. I'm curious about, we talk about all the money we're spending and all the bad things that people are doing in our name and so forth. I've been writing about this and researching it, and this is a very substantial part of the economy. There's hundreds of thousands of jobs in all the congressional districts. And this genocide isn't going to stop with Palestine and Ukraine. It's got to have new targets. It's a growth economy. I personally believe it's going to be pointed at Mexico next, across the famous border wall. So that just
Peter, you've cut out on us. We heard the first part of your comments. Yeah, your microphone is not functioning well.
Let me.
Maybe Peter could put it in the chat.
We did get the first question though, so.
Yeah, I think.
Okay.
Well, the point is,
Okay.
if you can hear this.
Yeah.
All that $6 trillion is investment. You cannot do anything on Earth unless you have investors. Everything is for investors. So there's a huge return on this investment. And every congressional district has hundreds of jobs involved in this genocide. It's a machine. This genocide is just it's just a test bed, right? Basically. What are we going to do when they point it at Mexico?
Okay, well, let's ask our commenters here.
Well, let me just say, as a general observation, you're absolutely right that the arms industry has a huge influence on shaping American foreign policy. It is diabolically effective. It's not just passing out campaign contributions, but as you point out, the arms makers have figured out who all the key members of Congress are. And when a large defense project comes up for bid, they split it up. They split up the project and put certain manufacturing in certain districts and certain in other places, so that members of Congress who vote against arms sales are being told, if you do this, hundreds of people in your district are going to lose their jobs. Now, our Cost of War project at Brown University has pointed out that although indeed the weapons industry does provide a lot of jobs, moving our focus towards healthcare and energy production would produce far more jobs. Nonetheless, you're right. It's a very hard box to break out of. NATO expansion all the way back in the 1990s was pushed relentlessly by the arms industry because every new country joining NATO has to buy an entire new arsenal, and it has to come from the United States. So you're absolutely right. There's a huge profit in manufacturing weapons. And the weapons industry is somewhere up there, almost near APAC in terms of its.
Right. I would add it's actually even a little more consciously conspiratorial than most of the other industries, in the sense that projects like the F-35, the bomber that's known for collapsing on the runway, the one that can't ever really fly, but somehow the Pentagon wants them and all of our international buyers want it. All but three congressional districts have at least some jobs that go into the creation of the F-35. It's designed that way to be the least efficient way of producing. The most efficient is to do things vertically, everything in one place. This is the opposite. Things get shipped across the world, across the country. It's unbelievable. And the good news is there are people who are already working with unions. There's a new book out from a former colleague of mine, Miriam Pemberton, forgetting the name of it, but she spent a year and a half on the road visiting places, like one is in Connecticut, I'm forgetting which town, where they produce submarines. And it's the production in town. It's most of the jobs in the town come down to that set of boat factories. And talking to people about the notion of what a just transition would look like, taking into account that people have to have jobs and that it's perfectly legitimate for people to say, well, we don't want to just give up our jobs, hoping that after a good union job for 30 years, I'm suddenly going to be able to find a job as a computer coder, and make a lot of money. It doesn't work that way. We know that. So what will it take to create real, just transitions in these things that take into account the need for jobs, but also take into account the cost in human life, in environmental degradation and destruction, and in all of the things that wars bring when we produce only things that are used to kill people and break things, the role of militaries. So I think there is some good news that there are organizations and unions and individuals and scholars and others who are working on this exact question that Peter raises of what do we do about the military-industrial complex? And that is that we struggle to figure out a way to transform our economy to get out from under that dependency.
Right. Thank you, Phyllis. Thanks very much, Stephen. Let's take a question from Leslie Minard. Leslie, is it Minard or Minard?
It's Minard.
Minard, great.
But it's spelled wrong. Okay, that's why, so you can call me Minard. I had a couple things I wanted to say. Elizabeth Fatah was talking about the two-party system a problem, and I really believe that is. I'm here in South Carolina. Ballot access is easy. You can get on with 10,000 signatures. You got to collect 10,000 verifiable. But in many states, it's basically illegal to have a third party. Like to get on the ballot in North Carolina, you need 75,000 signatures. I think, I've been in the peace movement for a long time, and all these young people are involved now because they have TikTok, and I think that's really what's really changed everything has pushed the legacy media to have to actually report on stuff because they're getting outdone by Instagram and TikTok, and then they've had no choice. But I don't know anybody in my new group of young friends that's going to vote for Biden or Trump. They're just going to leave it blank. But I think that something else that really needs to change is that we need to be able to have third parties and form coalitions, because it is, to me, a one-party system. I was hoping somebody would step up. The Green Party is still looking for a presidential candidate. Is anybody interested? I was trying to hire. Okay. And is anybody going to Chicago this year? Do you know history repeats itself? When was the last time? 1968, the Democratic convention was in Chicago. I think some people should think about showing up there. And I was also so Peter was talking about jobs in South Carolina. It is very secretive, more so than APEC. We have it's even called the Department of Energy, the Savannah River site. But it's not about energy, it's all about making bombs. They have a whole new plan now, which started under Clinton and Obama kicked it forward, and so did Trump, where they want to build, even though plutonium 4,000 years, build 90 new plutonium hits a year, and they're going to spread it around, and nobody knows about it. And every congressman in the state loves it. And like, you can ask anybody on the street in South Carolina, they don't know that this is getting ready to happen. Because that's where they had this mixed oxide fuel plant. That's a whole other thing where they flushed a bunch of money. And there could be jobs in cleanup, but I don't know how you turn that around. I do consider that a problem, but I would like to see somebody in like a nationwide movement to make ballot access easier. I think it could be different. And then I did have a question about Stephen Kinzer. You said it was 6 trillion on foreign wars since 9/11. Is that right? How much on foreign wars? I thought it was less.
So if you look at the cost of war project at Brown University, you'll see that they have figured into this how much you're going to have to pay for aftercare for veterans, how much you're going to have to pay for interest on our debt, since we're running all these wars on credit cards. So when you'll find it on their cost of war website. They have really granularly analyzed all this. Let me make one comment about your observation about the American political system. I don't think there's ever been a time when it's been more clear that the so-called two parties are not providing the alternatives that Americans want. You know, I'm looking at China as the opposite. So China has been ruled by one party for the last 70 years, but China has changed so radically. Think of where China was even 40 years ago. Think where it is now. Radical transformations, the like of which have hardly ever been seen in world history. And that's all with one party. We have two parties, but nothing ever changes. So I'm starting to think they may be onto something.
Thanks. Phyllis, did you have any comments on any of the various pieces? It was quite a comprehensive question.
Good comments. I'll wait for the next question.
Okay, great. Thank you, Leslie.
Thank you.
Let us take Nija Druby.
Okay, thank you. I've been thinking that all along our problems is really the money that it is our money that is being spent, and the lobbyists are spending enormous amounts of money that we will never be able to match as citizens. But why are we not able to say, I do not want my money to go into the military complex. I want my money to go into healthcare. I want my money to go into education. So if we concentrated on changing those rules, and it's very easy to change the IRS forms to be able to put in the check marks where you want your money to go, then we will regain control of our democracy, of our government, of our country.
That's why it won't happen, because that will allow you to regain control of your country and your government. So that's already a no-no. I think that's why it's so difficult. But go ahead, Phyllis.
I was just going to say it is very difficult. The only one that you're actually able to do that on IRS forms is on whether or not you want your $1 to go to a special fund to fund, have it be privately funded, which I happen to think is a good idea, to have public funding of electoral costs. But there is no option for choosing where your money will go.
I know there isn't any.
And you're right that's an interesting campaign. The Quakers for years have done a fascinating campaign out when they have tables and when they're trying to reach people. They usually have 4 or 5 jars and a big package of marbles, and they give each person who comes up 5 marbles and says, you can put all of them in one, or you can divide them up among the 5, or however you want to divide them. Each one is worth $100,000 or $1 million, whatever. Where do you want the priorities to be? And the jars are labeled military spending, healthcare, jobs, education, climate, and routinely the bottom one is the military. So the notion that the nation loves the military, it's the most trusted, there's ways you can phrase questions that will get you those answers on a poll to be able to brag about. But the reality is, when people are actually talking about what they want to spend money on, the military is the last part. People get that it does not keep us safe, that what keeps us safe is healthcare and jobs and education.
Thank you, Phyllis. And of course, one movement in the country that's trying to deal with with these types of issues is the Poor People's Campaign.
Absolutely.
Which is having on March 2nd assemblies at 31 state houses across the country, raising these very issues, including Gaza, but it'll be a very comprehensive program that most of us could really get behind. Let's
We
take
should also note, oh, sorry.
Go ahead.
I was just going to say, we should also note that both Reverend William Barber and Reverend Liz Theo-Harris, the two co-chairs of the Poor People's Campaign, are both participating in the march that's underway that started day before yesterday in Philadelphia and is marching to Washington. Will be arriving in Washington for a rally on the 21st, focused on a ceasefire in Gaza.
Wow, that's a huge,
a lot of faith leaders.
That's a huge development. For the Poor People's Campaign to move into that would be really something. Let's take a question from Leonard Shames, and then I think we should start to wind down. I'm gonna, as a moderator, I'm gonna take my prerogative and ask a last question after this one, if the speakers don't mind. Leonard, go ahead.
Okay, I should have called myself Lenny because most people know me as that. Has anyone, I have heard that when on October 7th, Israel is saying that they were completely caught by surprise. Does anyone else not believe that? It just seems very hard to believe that a country with one of the greatest surveillance and intelligence mechanisms in the world and is right next door to Gaza and knows that Hamas is one of their biggest enemies, that they were completely caught off guard. I have heard that there are people telling the higher-ups that there was unusual activity at the border that day, and they were completely ignored. Does anyone else want to speak about that?
Okay, thanks for that question.
Thanks for that. There is a fair amount of evidence. There's a particular unit of the Israeli military whose job it is to watch Hamas, watch organizations, watch the West Bank, watch the Gaza Strip, watch East Jerusalem, and watch Palestinians inside Israel itself. Most of the watchers in that unit are women. And there's a lot of suspicion that the reason they were not taken seriously by their commanders was that they were women. And they were, despite the fact that Israel prides itself on integrating women fully into the military, it's not fully equal in terms of who's listened to and who's not. That may have been a factor. The other thing that clearly was a factor, and it's hard to quantify how much of a factor, is that in the last year and a half or so, particularly in the period since this new far right government has been in power, one of the effects has been a demand to the Ministry of Defense, as they call it, the Israel Defense Forces, to redeploy a large proportion of the soldiers who had long been stationed around Gaza. You know, Gaza, like the West Bank, is surrounded by a wall, a militarized wall. It doesn't get as much publicity as the West Bank wall, what's known as the apartheid wall, but Gaza is also surrounded, and it's surrounded besides the wall by soldiers who monitor the comings and goings, or lack thereof, more to the point, of the people of Gaza. But over the last year, there's been a massive redeployment of a large proportion of those soldiers to the West Bank. The reason being that the West Bank is the ideological core of the land goals of the Israeli state, which is now dominated by Netanyahu and these far right, carefully described, in my view, as fascist parties, and self-defined in some ways. So in that context, it's not so unlikely, because you have to combine that with, there's a level of anti-Arab racism that is so powerful within Israeli culture, Israeli military strategy, etc., that essentially says the Arabs could not pull off a sophisticated major attack, that we on occasion face small-scale skirmishes over borders, etc. A few Israelis each year lose their lives, and that's tragic, but it's not something of substance that changes the nature of the state or that threatens the state. This was something of a different level that had not happened since probably the war of 1967, where you had armies from other countries coming in. This had never happened by Palestinians. And I think there was a vast level of reluctance to acknowledge just what had happened and that it was carried out by a small group. One of the things is also true that Hamas was not the only force operating inside Israel that day. Hamas, among other things, is known for an extraordinary level of discipline, and there was clearly a lack of discipline among some of the militants who came out of the break in the border wall. This was the first time there had been a break in that wall in 16 years. So you had a whole generation of young people in Gaza who had never been outside of Gaza as thinking, who were more than as babies or very young children. And when that wall went down, a lot of people flooded out of it and into Israel beyond just the militants of Hamas that had planned that action. Again, we don't know how many, we don't know which actions may have been carried out by those individuals accountable to no one and which were carried out by Hamas. So it's a very complicated question, and I think it will be some time before we're ever able to find out more of that information.
That's great, Phyllis. Stephen, what do you think?
Well, I would just like to close by saying that the most encouraging comment that I heard this whole evening that I'm really going to ponder was Phyllis's observation that we're not just beating our spoon on the high chair without anybody ever listening and nothing ever happens. Actually, that's not true. And she pointed out the dialogue, the way people talk about Israel and Palestine now is completely different from what it used to be before October 7th. That was a sudden change, but it took 20 years to produce a sudden change. That was the spark that set it off. You always hear that phrase, it took me many years to become an overnight sensation. Yeah, the dialogue and the way people talk about Israel and Gaza now is unbelievably different just from what it was 6 months ago. And that was set off by the attack and by the Israeli reaction. But in order for people to change their minds like this, there has to be years and years of plowing the fields and getting ready for it. And really, this is an encouraging comment to ponder for all of us because we're in a very frustrating business. And sometimes it does feel like it's hopeless. You're not making any progress. But what we've seen on Israel, the point that Phyllis made to me is really important. Yeah, it doesn't look like you're achieving something today, but keep at it. And these campaigns really can have a cumulative effect if you're willing to stay with them for a long time. I think that's the big message to take out of this evening, and that's the inspiration I got from what Phyllis had to say.
Okay, well, thank you, Stephen. And just let everyone know, Stephen will be speaking again at our rally next Saturday, the 24th, in Boston, for anyone from Massachusetts. Stephen is one of those people that just keeps getting the true history out there and challenging the official narrative. And it's just so wonderful to have him do that work for us. I just want to close. I think this is mainly going to be you, Phyllis. Where do we go with this situation in Gaza now? If, clearly the ceasefire is the immediate thing, and Biden keeps talking about a two-state solution, this is very suspicious what the U.S. is really up to there in terms of a really independent Palestinian state. Where does the movement go if we should reach a ceasefire? How do we prevent it from petering out and really drive through some real change for Palestinians this time?
I think, Paul, that we recognize what our government is doing to prevent Palestinian self-determination. There is not going to be a two-state solution that involves a sovereign Palestinian state because there's no land left for a Palestinian state. There are pieces of territory within the 22% of historic Palestine, that is the West Bank, that would be given over to some level of Palestinian administration, very much like the Palestinian Authority now, which has no authority, which has no power, which does serve as a protection force for Israeli settlers. That has been true from the beginning. That was true from Oslo. That was true after Oslo was no more the thing they talked about. So all of this recent talk about we have to go back to a two-state solution. it's a cover for the fact that they don't have an internationally recognized, legitimate, just solution based on international law that involves, for example, the right of return, et cetera. You know, there was a time that a two-state solution might have been possible. I was never a big fan, but it's not up to me. I'm a Jewish girl from California. It's not up to me to say how many states there should be. That's up to the people who live there. This is 7,000 miles away. This is not my country. And that's true for everybody in this country, including the president. Whatever he thinks, whatever he feels, should not be the basis of our policy. Right now, we have to fight for a ceasefire. It's not about what happens the day after. We're not there yet. We have to stop the killing. So let's not keep talking about, is there going to be a two-state solution? Is it going to be really just? Is it going to be equal? Will it have control of its own borders? Will it have control of the water? Will it have control of et cetera, et cetera? The answer is no, it won't. Get over it. Stop talking about it. We have to talk about a ceasefire and not what happens the next day. And for those who say, we can't have a ceasefire until we know what comes next, we don't get to say what comes next. We don't get to choose who governs. You know, there's all this talk now about, well, there could be a government of Palestinian technocrats who the US would support and put in power. Yeah, that worked really well in Iraq, didn't it? Worked pretty well in Afghanistan, didn't it? You know, haven't we learned anything from this? This is not our business to tell the Palestinians who should run Gaza. Our business is to stop a genocide. What the South African work has done at the United Nations Court, the International Court of Justice, is to put the entire world on notice, and 153 countries out of the world's total of 193 who are parties to the Genocide Convention, to put them on notice that they have obligations under that convention. It's the only convention that holds non-active parties, like in this case, the two parties are Israel versus South Africa. But all the other signatories who are parties to that convention have an obligation to do everything they can to end a genocide if it occurs and to prevent it from happening if it's about to happen. That's our job, is to make our government abide by international law and not let all of us remain complicit, which is what happens when we are paying for the genocide, we are protecting the commission of the genocide, and we are making sure that the people carrying out the genocide are never held accountable. That's our job, and it's a really big one. So we don't have to worry yet about what we're going to work on. There'll be plenty of wars to stop. There'll be plenty of work to do. Occupation's not going to end right away. Apartheid's not going to disappear by itself. Our job right now is to stop the killing. We need a ceasefire, and that's what I would leave people with.
Thank you, Phyllis. And thank you, Stephen. Thank you very much, everyone who tuned in tonight. We had a wonderful crowd. And so the magic word is ceasefire. And let's keep pushing that. And there's a great movement around it. Let's hope we can build one around Ukraine as well. And let's see where things go, and let's do our best. So thanks to everyone. Please get involved with these campaigns. If you're in Massachusetts, Massachusetts Peace Action is a good place to go, but there's plenty of other organizations, especially on Gaza right now, that you could participate in according to the way you see the world. And we just have to keep it going, and we'll keep on having these educational and public events and lobbying, and let's see what Medea has to tell us after she goes after Congress tomorrow. So thanks an awful lot. Good night, everybody. Thank you, Jean. See you. Thank you, Cole.
Good night.